Look down at your dinner plate tonight. See that white crystal scattered across your food? You barely notice it. You reach for it without thinking. But that tiny mineral has shaped empires, sparked wars, and built cities from nothing. This is Taste of History, where we uncover the hidden forces that flavored our world. Every week, we take something, ordinary something sitting in your kitchen right now, and trace its extraordinary past. Because the story of what we eat is the story of who we are. It's rebellion in a tea leaf, revolution in a spice jar, civilization in a grain of salt. Today, salt, the most common seasoning on earth, the one ingredient you never run out of. Cheap, abundant, forgettable. But here's what you don't know. For most of human history, salt was worth more than gold. Kingdoms rose and fell over access to it. Cities emerged in the middle of nowhere just to mine it. Roman soldiers were paid in it. That's where we get the word salary. Gandhi marched 240 miles to make it illegally and brought an empire to its knees. Salt doesn't just make food taste better, it preserves it. In a world without refrigeration, salt meant survival. It meant you could store meat through winter, ship fish across oceans, feed armies on the march, control salt, and you controlled life itself. But salt is invisible in another way. It's been so essential for so long that we've forgotten its power. We take it for granted. We undersalt our food and oversalt our roads. We have more of it than we know what to do with. That wasn't always true. So how did we get here? How did one of Earth's most valuable resources become something we throw on icy sidewalks? The answer takes us back 10,000 years, to the moment humans discovered they couldn't live without it. When salt stopped being a luxury and became a necessity. When the search for white gold began. Because every civilization that's ever existed has needed salt. And every civilization has had to figure out where to get it. That's where our story begins. Salt is everywhere and nowhere. The ocean contains enough salt to bury every continent under a 500-foot layer of solid sodium chloride. There are salt deposits underground larger than entire countries. But for early humans, none of that mattered, because salt doesn't announce itself. It doesn't grow on trees. You can't hunt it. And unless you know exactly where to look, you'll walk right past it 1,000 times and never know it's there. There are only 4 ways to find salt in nature. The ocean, the most obvious source, but the hardest to extract. Seawater is only 3.5% salt. You need massive evaporation to get anything useful. Salt springs, rare places where underground salt deposits dissolve into groundwater and bubble to the surface. These were worth their weight in gold, literally. Rock salt deposits, dried up ancient seas, now buried underground. You had to know they were there, and you had to be willing to dig. And salt lakes, shallow bodies of water in arid climates that evaporate naturally, leaving pure salt behind. The easiest source, also the rarest. Early humans had to find these places, map them, remember them, protect them. For most of human prehistory, salt wasn't actually that hard to get. Hunter-gatherers had it figured out. They ate meat. Organs are particularly rich in sodium. Liver, kidneys, blood. A fresh kill could provide days' worth of salt in a single meal. They drank animal blood, which contains the same salt concentration as human blood. Perfect replacement. And when they needed more, they knew where to go. Humans have an instinct for salt. We can taste it at concentrations as low as 10 parts per million. That's like detecting a single grain of salt in a swimming pool. This wasn't random. This was survival. Archaeological evidence shows hunter-gatherers traveled enormous distances to reach salt sources. The Kalahari Sand people in southern Africa knew every salt pan within 200 miles. They'd make pilgrimages during dry season, when evaporation left pure salt crystals behind. Native American tribes in North America established trade networks around salt springs and salt licks. These weren't just resources, they were sacred sites. Neutral ground where even warring tribes could gather salt without violence. Salt was that important. Then came farming, and farming destroyed the salt equation. Around 10,000 BC, in the Fertile Crescent, humans began domesticating wheat and barley. Within 3,000 years, agriculture spread across the Middle East, into Europe, throughout Asia, and everywhere it went, it created the same problem. A hunter-gatherer eating 50% meat gets plenty of salt naturally, maybe 3 to 5 grams per day, right in the range the human body needs. A farmer eating 80% grain gets maybe 1 gram, maybe. That's not enough, not even close. Farmers worked harder than hunter-gatherers, longer hours, more physical labor, more sweat. They needed more salt, but their diet gave them less. The deficit was catastrophic. We can see it in the archaeological record. Skeletal remains from early farming communities show signs of salt deficiency, muscle weakness, bone abnormalities, neurological damage. Salt became the limiting factor for agricultural expansion. You could grow all the grain you wanted, but without salt to preserve it and keep your workers healthy, your settlement failed. This created the world's first supply crisis. And that crisis created the world's first industry. Let's talk about where salt production actually began, not where humans first tasted salt, but where they first deliberately harvested it, processed it, and traded it. The oldest salt production site we've ever found, Solnitsata, in modern Bulgaria. Carbon dating puts it at 5500 BC, 7,500 years ago. It wasn't a village, it wasn't a town, it was a factory. Built next to a salt spring, Solnitsata existed for one purpose: turn spring water into salt. Archaeologists found enormous ceramic vessels, designed specifically for boiling brine, hundreds of them. The process was simple, but labor-intensive. Collect spring water in vessels, boil it over fire until the water evaporates, scrape out the salt crystals, repeat for hours, days, weeks. The people of Solnitsata became rich, wealthier than any farming community had a right to be, because they didn't sell grain. They sold the one thing every farmer desperately needed. Move forward 4,000 years. Deep in the Austrian Alps, there's a valley called Hallstatt, which literally means salt town. In 1500 BC, miners here discovered something extraordinary. A mountain made of salt, not a deposit, not a vein. An entire mountain, an ancient sea that had dried up millions of years ago, compacted into pure rock salt, then buried under alpine peaks. The Hallstatt miners went underground. They dug shafts hundreds of feet deep, built timber supports, created ventilation systems. They mined salt in absolute darkness, carrying torches made of pine soaked in animal fat. And they got rich doing it. Hallstatt salt was so pure, so abundant, that it supplied Central Europe for over 1,000 years. The mines are still operational today. 3,000 years. Continuous production. China faced a unique problem. Enormous population, massive agricultural base, but most of the country sits far inland, nowhere near the ocean. So the Chinese innovated. In the Yangtze River Valley, workers discovered natural gas seeping from the ground. They drilled deep wells, some over 3,000 feet, using bamboo drilling rigs. When they hit brine, they used the natural gas to fuel evaporation furnaces, the first industrial use of natural gas in human history, all for salt. By 2000 BC, China was producing salt on an industrial scale, not villages making salt for themselves, but massive operations employing thousands, producing tons, feeding millions. This is when salt stopped being something communities made and became something government controlled. Not all salt came from high-tech operations. Across sub-Saharan Africa, from Senegal to Ethiopia, Communities relied on seasonal salt pans, shallow depressions that filled with water during the rainy season, then evaporated completely during the dry months. What remained was pure solar salt. No boiling required, no mining, just waiting. The Tuareg people of the Sahara built an entire economy around this. They controlled the salt pans of Taudini in modern Mali, one of the most hostile deserts on Earth. For over 1,000 years, caravans of camels carried salt south across the Sahara, trading it for gold, grain, and slaves. Pound for pound, salt was worth as much as gold. In some places, it was worth more. Look at these sites together: Bulgaria, Austria, China, Africa. Different continents, different cultures, different technologies, but the same pattern. Wherever humans found salt, civilization followed. Trade networks formed, wealth accumulated, power centralized. Salt wasn't just a resource, it was the resource, the foundation everything else was built on. But finding salt was only the beginning. Once you had it, you needed to move it, transport it hundreds of miles to the people who needed it most. You needed roads, ships, caravans, protection. You needed the greatest trade networks the ancient world had ever seen. And that's where our story goes next. Here's a question that changed everything. What do you do with a dead animal in a world without refrigeration? You eat what you can. Maybe 20 pounds of meat if you're a small group. Maybe 100 if you're a village. But a cow weighs 1,200 pounds. A pig, 300. One good fishing haul could bring in 1,000 fish. Without preservation, it's all waste. Rotting meat within days, spoiled fish within hours. Every calorie you can't eat immediately is a calorie lost forever. This was humanity's fundamental problem for 200,000 years, until salt solved it. Salt doesn't just season food, it stops time. Here's how. Bacteria need water to survive. They're basically tiny bags of water themselves. To reproduce, to eat, to live, they need moisture. Salt destroys that. When you pack meat in salt, osmosis pulls water out of bacterial cells. They shrivel. They die. The meat stays safe for months, years, if you do it right. This isn't cooking. This isn't drying. This is chemistry creating immortality. And once humans figured this out, everything changed. Let's start with meat. Before salting, you had to eat fresh kills immediately. That meant small-scale hunting, constant foraging, no stockpiles, no security. After salting, you could hunt a single large animal and make it last all winter. The Vikings perfected this. They'd slaughter livestock in November, pack the meat in barrels of salt, and have protein through March. Salted pork, salted beef, salted mutton. Without salt, there's no Viking expansion, no longships crossing the Atlantic, because you can't sail for months without preserved food. The Romans did the same thing. Salumen, salted meat, was a legionary staple. Soldiers could march for weeks, carrying nothing but grain and salted pork. Salt didn't just preserve food, it preserved armies, empires. But meat was just the beginning. Fish changed the world, because fish is different from meat. It spoils faster within hours of the catch. Fish guts contain enzymes that start breaking down flesh immediately. Even in cold water, you've got maybe a day before it's inedible, unless you salt it. The Atlantic cod is not a glamorous fish. It's bland, ugly, bony. But it saved Europe. Starting around 1000 AD, Basque fishermen in northern Spain discovered something extraordinary. If you split a cod, remove the guts, pack it in salt, and let it dry, it becomes almost indestructible. Bacalao, salt cod. It could last for years. It didn't need refrigeration. It was pure protein, ready to eat anywhere. Suddenly, fishing wasn't a coastal activity, it was an industry. Ships could sail to the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, some of the richest fishing grounds on Earth, catch thousands of cod, salt them on board, and sail back to Europe. Months-long voyages, no spoilage. This is what enabled European exploration. Not better ships, not better navigation. Salt. Here's what preservation meant for trade. Before salt, trade was local. You could only move goods as fast as they could travel before spoiling. Maybe 50 miles, maybe 100 if you were lucky. After salt, distance became irrelevant. Salted fish from Norway reached Rome. Salted pork from Germany reached Constantinople. Chinese salted vegetables traveled the Silk Road for 4,000 miles. Trade networks exploded, and this created something that had never existed. If you're a coastal village, you can focus entirely on fishing. Salt your catch, sell it inland. Buy grain with the profits. You don't need farm. You have a product that never spoils. If you're an inland farming community, you can focus entirely on grain. Buy salted fish from the coast. You don't need to fish. You have a stable protein source. Suddenly, people could do one thing well instead of doing everything poorly. This is the birth of the economy as we know it. And it only works because salt makes storage possible. Think about what storage means. Without storage, you live harvest to harvest. One bad season, and you starve. There's no surplus, no safety net, no growth. With storage, you can accumulate wealth, save food for winter, feed people who don't farm, craftsmen, soldiers, priests, artists. Salt-preserved food was the world's first savings account. Venice understood this better than anyone. By the 13th century, Venice controlled the Mediterranean salt trade. They didn't just sell salt, they used it. Venetian warehouses stored millions of pounds of salted fish, salted meat, salted vegetables. When famine hit Europe, Venice had food. When wars disrupted supply chains, Venice had food. That's why a city built on a swamp became one of the richest powers in Europe. Storage is power. Now let's talk about cities. Cities are impossible without salt. Think about it. A city is thousands, sometimes millions of people living in close proximity. They're not farming, they're not fishing, they're building, trading, governing, creating. They need food constantly from somewhere else, and that food needs to survive the journey. Ancient Rome at its peak had over 1 million residents. They weren't growing grain in the Forum. They were importing it from Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, and they were importing salted fish from Spain, salted pork from Gaul, salted olives from Greece. Without preservation, Rome doesn't exist. You can't feed 1 million people on fresh food alone. The logistics are impossible. The same pattern repeats everywhere. London, Paris, Beijing, Cairo. Every major city in history relied on salted food to survive. Urbanization is only possible because salt makes food mobile. And here's the result. In 10,000 BC, before agriculture and salt preservation, Earth's human population was maybe 5 million. Hunter-gatherers living hand to mouth. By 1 AD, after thousands of years of salt-enabled agriculture and trade, the population had grown to 300 million. By 1800 AD, it reached 1 billion. Salt didn't just preserve food, it preserved humanity. But here's what we forget. Salt preservation wasn't just practical, it became cultural, delicious, defining. The cuisines we love today were born from necessity. Italy prosciutto started as a way to preserve pork without refrigeration. Now, it's a delicacy. People pay $30 a pound for what was once peasant food. Scandinavia, gravlax, salmon cured in salt and sugar. The word literally means grave salmon, because they used to bury it in the ground with salt to preserve it. Korea, kimchi, fermented vegetables preserved with salt, a survival food during harsh winters. Now a UNESCO cultural heritage item. Japan miso, soy sauce, tsukemono, all preservation techniques, all essential to Japanese identity. Spain, jamón ibérico, bacalao, anchovy. The entire Spanish culinary tradition is built on salt. Here's the beautiful irony. We invented these techniques to avoid starvation, to make food last when we had no other choice. Now we make them because we love them. Cured meats, pickled vegetables, salted fish. These aren't survival foods anymore. They're art. But they only exist because for thousands of years, salt was the difference between eating and starving. So let's zoom out. What did preservation actually do for civilization? It made food mobile. That enabled trade. It made food storable. That enabled cities. It made specialization possible. That enabled economies. It made survival predictable. That enabled population growth. And it created flavors so powerful that we still crave them thousands of years later. Every time you eat bacon, you're eating a preservation technique developed by people who had no choice. Every time you eat sushi with soy sauce, you're tasting a flavor invented to make food last. Every time you reach for pickles, cheese, olives, or cured meat, you're experiencing the legacy of salt preservation. But here's the catch. All of this, the trade, the cities, the cuisines, the civilizations, required massive amounts of salt. More salt than any natural source could provide. So humans did what humans do. They built infrastructure. They organized labor. They created systems. They turned salt from a resource into an industry. And that industry became so valuable, so essential, that it caught the attention of the most powerful force in human society: government. Imagine you're a king or an emperor, a pharaoh, whatever. You're looking at your kingdom and you realize something. Every single person in your territory needs salt to survive. Not wants it, needs it. Will die without it. And there are only a few places where salt comes from. This is the most perfect monopoly in human history. Control the salt, and you control everyone who eats, which is everyone. Let's start with Rome. Because Rome didn't just use salt. Rome built an empire on it. 300 BC, the Roman Republic is expanding. They need money for roads, aqueducts, armies, temples. So they look at salt. There are salt flats at the mouth of the Tiber River, near modern-day Ostia, shallow pools where seawater evaporates in the Mediterranean sun, leaving behind pure white crystals. The Romans build a road, the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. It runs 150 miles from the coast straight to Rome, purpose-built for salt transport. But here's the genius. It's not just about moving salt to the city. It's about controlling who moves it, how much they move, and what they pay for the privilege. Every cart of salt that enters Rome gets taxed. Every merchant gets licensed. Every transaction gets recorded. The Via Salaria becomes one of the most profitable pieces of infrastructure in the ancient world. Now, about those soldiers. Roman legionaries didn't get paid in gold. Not at first. They got paid in salt. Salarium, the salt allowance, a fixed ration of salt to preserve their food, season their meals, and trade for other goods. This is where we get the word salary. Think about what this means. Rome is paying its armies with a substance that soldiers need to live, but that Rome completely controls. You can't rebel if your paycheck is tied to government-controlled infrastructure. You can't desert if you need salt rations to survive. It's brilliant and brutal. By 200 AD, Rome has salt production sites across the empire. Spain, Britain, Gaul, North Africa, Egypt. All of them taxed, all of them regulated, all of them feeding revenue back to Rome. Salt isn't just funding the military, it's funding aqueducts, roads, baths, temples, the entire apparatus of Roman civilization. And every citizen pays, because every citizen eats. But Rome was playing checkers. China was playing chess. 221 BC. The Qin dynasty unifies China under a single emperor for the first time. Emperor Qin Shi Huang looks at his new empire and asks a simple question: how do I keep it? The answer: salt monopoly. He declares that all salt production is now state property. Private production is banned. Private sales are banned. The penalty for breaking these laws is death. Not fines, not jail. Death. Because salt isn't just revenue, it's control. The Han Dynasty, which came after the Qin, took it even further. They created a government bureau specifically for salt administration, appointed officials to oversee every stage of production, hired workers directly, set prices centrally, distributed salt through state-run warehouses. This wasn't taxation. This was complete vertical integration, and it worked. By 100 AD, the salt monopoly generated more revenue than any other source in China, more than taxes on land, more than taxes on trade. Estimates suggest salt revenue accounted for 50% of the government's total income. 50%. An entire empire funded by controlling a single mineral. Here's why salt monopolies were so effective. First, everyone needs it. Rich, poor, peasant, noble. There's no opt-out. No exemption. You eat, you pay. Second, it's easily controlled. Salt comes from specific locations. You can't grow it in your backyard. You can't fake it. You have to get it from official sources. Third, it's visible. You can't hide salt consumption. Markets sell it openly. Households use it daily. Tax collectors can see exactly how much you're buying. Fourth demand is inelastic. If the price doubles, people don't buy half as much. They buy the same amount and go hungry elsewhere. This is a tax collector's dream. And it wasn't just Rome and China. France. The gabelle, a salt tax, so hated that it helped spark the French Revolution. Different regions paid different rates, creating massive smuggling operations. People were executed for illegal salt trafficking. India. The British East India Company established a salt monopoly in the 18th century. Indians were forbidden from collecting or selling their own salt, even from ocean water, on their own shores. They had to buy British salt at inflated prices. Venice controlled Mediterranean salt trade for 500 years. Any ship passing through Venetian territory had to pay salt duty. The city's wealth was built on this monopoly. Let's focus on France for a moment. The gabelle was introduced in 1341. Every French household was required to purchase a minimum amount of salt per year, whether they needed it or not, at prices set by the crown. And here's the twist. The price varied wildly by region. In some areas, salt cost 30 times more than in others. Not because of scarcity, because of politics. Regions that had rebelled against the king paid higher rates. Loyal regions paid less. Salt became a weapon. This created a massive black market. Fauconniers, salt smugglers. They'd buy salt in low-tax regions, smuggle it into high-tax regions, and sell it at a profit. The punishment if caught? Execution, or being sent to the galleys as forced labor. Over 500 years, an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 people were executed for salt, smuggling in France alone, all over a mineral the human body needs to survive. Here's a question you might be asking. If salt was so valuable, why didn't governments just ban it and force people to suffer? Because that's not how power works. A dead population pays no taxes. A starving population can't farm, can't work, can't fight. Governments didn't want to eliminate salt. They wanted to monopolize it, keep the supply flowing, but control every ounce, tax every transaction, make yourself indispensable. This is the fundamental logic of state control. You don't withhold what people need. You make them dependent on you for it. Think about it economically. If you ban salt, you get nothing. People die or revolt. If you regulate salt, you get perpetual revenue forever. From everyone. It's not sadism, it's strategy. A salt tax is a subscription model. You pay every day, every month, every year. As long as you're alive, you're paying. No empire in history ever gave that up voluntarily. And to make it work, you need enforcement. China had salt inspectors who traveled from village to village, checking production sites, inspecting warehouses, auditing merchants. Rome had publicani, tax farmers, who bought the right to collect salt taxes in specific regions, then kept a percentage of what they collected. France had salt police, dedicated forces, whose only job was catching smugglers. Entire bureaucracies existed just to control salt. But here's what's fascinating. For most of history, people accepted this. They hated the salt tax. They smuggled when they could. They complained bitterly, but they paid. Why? Because the alternative was worse. Without state-organized salt distribution, many regions simply couldn't get salt at all. Governments provided infrastructure, roads, ports, warehouses, protection from bandits. They standardized quality. They ensured supply during famines. The monopoly was oppressive, but it was also functional. Look at the pattern across empires. Rome. Salt funds military expansion and infrastructure. China. Salt funds bureaucracy and defense against nomadic invasions. France. Salt funds wars, palaces, and the royal court. Britain. Salt funds colonial administration in India. Every major empire in history used salt the same way, as a guaranteed revenue stream that couldn't be avoided, couldn't be evaded, and would never run dry. Salt wasn't just part of him, salt was empire. But monopolies create pressure. When you control something everyone needs, and you charge for it, and you enforce it with violence, eventually, someone pushes back. Sometimes that pushback is smuggling, tax evasion, black markets, and sometimes it's revolution. Because the thing about salt is this: it's essential. People can't live without it, which means they'll fight for it. There's a special kind of cruelty in taxing something people need to survive. Not luxury goods, not entertainment, not comfort, survival. And when that tax becomes unbearable, when it's enforced with violence, when the rich can afford it, but the poor cannot, something breaks. People don't just evade taxes. They resist, they smuggle, they revolt. And sometimes, they burn the system down. We talked about France's gabelle in the last chapter. But we didn't talk about what it actually meant for ordinary people. Let's fix that. Remember, every French household was required to buy a minimum amount of salt every year, usually around 15 to 20 pounds per person, whether you needed it or not, whether you could afford it or not. In high-tax regions like Brittany, that salt cost the equivalent of a week's wages for a peasant farmer. In low-tax regions like Franche-Comté, it cost a day's wages. Same salt, same country, 10 times the price. Let's do the math. A peasant family of 5 needs 75 to 100 pounds of salt per year. In a high-tax region, that could cost 30 to 40% of their annual income. Not income after food and shelter. Total income. You're choosing between salt and eating. And if you don't buy the minimum, you're fined or arrested or both. This wasn't taxation. This was extortion. So people smuggled, and smuggling became one of the largest underground economies in France. They called them faux sauniers, false salt workers, men, women, sometimes entire families who bought salt in low-tax regions and smuggled it into high-tax zones. The profit margin was enormous. Buy salt for 2 livres, sell it for 20. You could feed your family for a year on a few successful runs, but the risk was catastrophic. France deployed thousands of agents to catch smugglers. The Gabelous Salt Police. They patrolled roads, searched carts, raided homes, interrogated villagers. If they caught you with untaxed salt, the penalty scaled with the offense. First offense, massive fine, confiscation of goods. Second offense, forced labor in the galleys, chained to an oar, rowing warships until you died. Third offense, execution, public hanging. Between 1680 and 1789, an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 people were executed for salt smuggling. Tens of thousands more were sent to galleys. Women caught smuggling had their heads shaved and were branded on the shoulder, a permanent mark of criminality. All for carrying salt. But the smugglers adapted. They built sophisticated networks, safe houses, hidden routes through forests and mountains, signals to warn patrols. Some smugglers carried 80 to 100 pounds of salt on their backs, walking 30 miles at night through hostile terrain. Others used children, kids as young as 8, because the penalties for minors were lighter. Entire villages collaborated. If everyone smuggled a little, no one person bore too much risk. This wasn't crime. This was survival organized as resistance. Here's what made the gabelle unbearable. It was viciously regressive. Nobles didn't pay the gabelle. Clergy didn't pay. Government officials didn't pay. Only commoners paid. The people who could least afford salt carried the entire burden, and it got worse. Salt was taxed, but luxury goods, silk, wine, imported spices, faced minimal taxation. You could buy Persian carpets more cheaply than the salt to preserve your winter vegetables. What does that tell a peasant? Your survival matters less than noble comfort. Your labor funds palaces you'll never enter. Your children go hungry, so courtiers can feast. The gabelle wasn't just unpopular. It was a daily reminder of inequality. Every time you salted your food, you were reminded that the system didn't care if you lived or died. By the 18th century, salt riots were constant. 1548. The Poitou Revolt in southwestern France. Peasants attacked salt warehouses, killed tax collectors, burned government buildings. The crown crushed it with military force. 1675. The Révolte du papier timbré in Brittany started as a protest against stamp taxes, but quickly focused on salt. Thousands marched. The army killed hundreds. 1773. Salt protests in Provence. Tax collectors were beaten, warehouses looted. The government sent in troops. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern. Anger building, pressure rising, a society approaching the breaking point. 1789. The French Revolution is about to begin. King Louis XVI, desperate for money and political support, asks the French people to write down their grievances. The Cahiers de Doléances, books of complaints. Guess what's in almost every single one? The gabelle. Not as one complaint among many, as the complaint. Village after village, town after town, the same demand: abolish the salt tax. One cahier from Brittany reads, "The gabelle is the most odious of all taxes, crushing the poor and enriching the rich." Another, "We would rather die than continue under this tyranny." This wasn't rhetoric. This was revolution waiting to happen. The French Revolution explodes in 1789. The Bastille falls. The king loses power. And in August 1790, the National Assembly abolishes gabelle. Gone. After 450 years. The announcement sparks celebrations across France. People dance in the streets. Church bells ring, not because of ideology, not because of political theory, because they can finally afford salt. France isn't unique. Everywhere salt is taxed heavily. Political instability follows. Moscow, 1648. Tsar Alexis raises the salt tax to fund wars against Poland. The price quadruples overnight. Poor Russians, who rely on salted fish and vegetables to survive winter, can't afford it. Bread riots turn into salt riots. Thousands storm the Kremlin. Government buildings burn. Tax collectors are dragged from their homes and beaten to death in the streets. The Tsar is forced to rescind the tax. But the damage is done. The riot destabilizes his rule for years. 184 AD, China. The Han Dynasty. The salt monopoly has been in place for 300 years. It's generated enormous revenue, but at a cost. Corruption is rampant. Officials skim profits. Regional warlords control production. Salt prices skyrocket. Peasants can't afford it. The Yellow Turban Rebellion erupts. 500,000 peasants, many of them motivated by economic desperation, rise up against the empire. The rebellion lasts 20 years. Millions die. The Han Dynasty never fully recovers. Salt wasn't the only cause, but it was cause. And then there's India. Under British rule, Indians are forbidden from collecting salt themselves, even from seawater. Even on their own land, they must buy British salt at inflated prices or face arrest. This monopoly generates massive revenue for the British Raj, but it plants seeds of resistance. We'll come back to India because what happens there changes everything. Look at the pattern. France salt tax fuels revolution. Russia's salt tax sparks riots and instability. China's salt monopoly contributes to dynastic collapse. India's salt monopoly becomes the flashpoint for independence. When you tax survival, you create desperation. When you enforce that tax with violence, you create rage. When that rage builds for long enough, it explodes. Salt became the symbol of oppressive taxation because it represented everything wrong with the system. It was universal. Everyone suffered. It was visible. You couldn't hide it. It was essential. You couldn't live without it. And it was cruel the rich didn't pay, but the poor did. Other taxes could be rationalized. Land taxes paid for infrastructure. Trade taxes funded navies. But salt taxes? Those just felt like punishment for being alive. But the story doesn't end with riots, rebellions. Because in 1930, one man in India looked at the British salt monopoly and saw opportunity, not for violence, not for traditional revolt, but for something more powerful. Nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience on a scale the world had never seen. His name was Mohandas Gandhi, and his weapon was salt. Let's talk about distance. The Sahara Desert is 3.5 million square miles of sand, rock, and merciless sun. Temperatures hit 130 degrees Fahrenheit. There's no water, no shade, no mercy. For centuries, humans crossed anyway. Not for exploration, not for adventure, for salt. Because on one side of the Sahara, there was salt worth more than gold. And on the other side, there was gold worth less than salt. This trade built kingdoms, destroyed cultures, and connected continents in ways we still don't fully understand. The trans-Saharan salt trade wasn't a single route, it was a network. Dozens of paths crisscrossing the desert, connecting North Africa to sub-Saharan West Africa. Each journey took 60 to 90 days, one way. The salt came from Taudini in modern Mali. Taudini is hell on earth. No vegetation, no permanent residence. Just salt mines worked by whoever's desperate enough. Workers cut massive blocks of salt from dried lake beds. Each block weighs 100 pounds. They're loaded onto camels, 6 to 8 blocks per animal. Then the caravan begins. Imagine 1,000 camels walking single file across the Sahara. They travel at night to avoid the worst heat, navigate by stars, carry just enough water to survive. If a sandstorm hits, entire caravans disappear. If they miss a water source, everyone dies. This wasn't trade. This was an expedition to the edge of human endurance, every single time. When the salt reaches cities like Timbuktu, Gao, or Janneh, something extraordinary happens. The math flips. In the Sahara, salt is cheap. In West Africa's rainforests and savannas, hundreds of miles from any salt source, it's priceless. West African kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, controlled gold mines. They had so much gold it was used for everyday items, but they had almost no salt. So they traded, pound for pound, salt for gold. Think about that for a second. Gold, one of the rarest metals on earth, being traded at equal weight for salt. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan explorer, wrote in 1352 that in some West African markets, salt was more valuable than gold. Not metaphorically, literally. A merchant could carry 500 pounds of salt south, trade it for 500 pounds of gold, and return north a wealthy man if he survived. But here's where the story gets darker, because salt wasn't the only commodity moving across the Sahara. North African and Arab traders brought salt south. They traded it for gold and slaves. Those slaves were then forced to mine more gold, harvest more goods, and some were transported north across the same desert routes. And many of those slaves ended up working in the salt mines of Taodeni, mining the salt that would be traded for more slaves. This is the cycle. Salt enables the slave trade. The slave trade produces salt. The system feeds itself. Between the 8th and 19th centuries, an estimated 9 to 12 million people were trafficked across the Sahara, not across the Atlantic, across the desert. Many of them died in transit. Many more died in mines. And salt was the economic engine that made it profitable. This is uncomfortable. We talk about salt as essential, as civilization building, as democratizing, but it was also this, an engine of human suffering, a commodity that justified enslavement. A resource so valuable that human lives became the acceptable cost of acquiring it. Both things are true. Now let's jump to a different continent. Because the European colonial system had its own relationship with salt, and it was just as exploitative. Here's how it worked. European ships sailed to West Africa with manufactured goods, textiles, weapons, alcohol. They traded those goods for enslaved people. Those enslaved people were transported across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and Americas. In the Caribbean, they worked sugar plantations. In the Americas, they worked cotton, tobacco, and rice plantations. And they were fed salted fish. We talked about salt cod earlier, bacalao. Dried salted fish from the North Atlantic. It was cheap. It lasted forever. It required no refrigeration, and it became the primary protein source for enslaved people on plantations. Ships from New England and Newfoundland caught cod, salted it, and sold it to plantation owners in the Caribbean. Those plantation owners fed it to enslaved laborers. The enslaved laborers produced sugar, cotton, and tobacco. Those goods were shipped to Europe. European ships returned to New England with manufactured goods, restarting the cycle. This is the Atlantic Triangle. Manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, raw materials to Europe, and salt was the lubricant. Without salt preservation, you can't feed enslaved laborers cheaply enough to make plantations profitable. Without salt cod, the entire system becomes economically unviable. Salt didn't just enable the slave trade, it was structurally necessary for it. By the 18th century, the Caribbean was the richest region in the world per capita, not because of natural resources, because of sugar. And sugar production required massive labor forces working in brutal conditions. Those laborers needed protein. Salted fish provided it. The economics are brutal but simple. Salt preservation made human exploitation profitable on an industrial scale. This required an enormous supply chain. Ireland specialized in salted pork and beef. Irish provisions supplied the British Navy for 200 years. Scotland produced salted herring. England controlled Caribbean salt pans for salt production. All of it coordinated, standardized, and controlled by the British Admiralty. This wasn't just logistics. This was empire running on salt. France did the same thing. So did Spain. So did Portugal. Every colonial empire built preservation systems to feed their militaries, their settlers, their administrators, and every one of those systems relied on salt. Here's the thing. Without salt preservation, European colonial empires don't work. You can't sail to India if your food rots before you get there. You can't establish Caribbean colonies if you can't feed the people working there. You can't maintain garrisons in Africa, Asia, or the Americas without preserved provisions. Salt isn't a detail in the story of colonialism. It's a prerequisite. By the 18th century, salt trade routes covered the entire globe. Trans-Saharan caravans moving salt south and gold north. Atlantic ships carrying salted cod to the Caribbean and sugar back to Europe. British merchant vessels transporting Irish salt beef to India. Chinese junks moving salt along coastal trade routes. Spanish galleons carrying Mexican salt across the Pacific. Every major trade route in the world involved salt, not as a luxury, as a necessity. Salt enabled long-distance trade by making food portable, and that trade built the global economy we recognize today. But that economy was built on exploitation. Enslaved people mining salt in the Sahara. Enslaved people fed with salted fish in the Caribbean. Indentured laborers working salt pans in India. Colonized populations taxed on salt they couldn't live without. We can't tell the story of salt without telling this part. Salt preserved food. Salt enabled empires. Salt connected continents. And salt was also the economic justification for centuries of human suffering. Both things are true, and we have to sit with that. But the system couldn't last forever, because empires built on exploitation create their own resistance. And in India, under British rule, that resistance found its perfect symbol. Not violence, not armies. Salt. For 10,000 years, salt was power. Empires rose and fell over it. Wars were fought for it. People died mining it, smuggling it, trying to control it. And then, in less than a century, it became worthless. Not because we stopped needing it. We need it just as much as we always did, but because we figured out how to make it abundant. And abundance destroyed its power. The shift began underground. Remember Hallstatt. Miners working by torchlight, chipping salt from rock faces with hand tools, carrying it to the surface in leather bags. Dangerous, slow, expensive. A skilled miner might extract a ton of salt per week, maybe. That scarcity kept prices high, kept salt valuable, kept governments interested in controlling it. Then came mechanization. Steam-powered drills that could cut through rock salt 50 times faster than human labor. Mechanical elevators that could haul tons of salt to the surface in minutes instead of hours. Rail systems inside mines that moved salt with industrial efficiency. By the 1870s, a single mechanized mine in Germany could produce more salt in a day than an entire pre-industrial mine produced in a year. In 1896, the Detroit Salt Company pioneered a new technique. Instead of mining solid rock salt, they drilled deep wells into underground deposits and pumped in water. The water dissolved the salt. They pumped the brine back up, evaporated it in massive industrial furnaces. Output thousands of tons per month, cost a fraction of traditional mining. This was salt production as a factory process. Standardized, scalable, unstoppable. By 1900, the industrial world was drowning in salt. Global salt production in 1800, maybe 5 million tons per year. Global salt production in 1900, over 20 million tons per year. Today, over 280 million tons per year. We produce more salt in a single day now than entire empires produced in a year, and prices collapsed. In 1800, a pound of salt might cost a day's wages for a laborer. By 1900, a pound of salt cost less than a loaf of bread. By 1950, salt was so cheap, it wasn't worth measuring its value against anything meaningful. This destroyed government monopolies overnight. Why tax salt when it's cheaper than dirt? Why control production when anyone with a drill and a furnace can make it? France's gabelle was gone. China's monopoly was meaningless. British colonial salt taxes were abolished, not out of generosity, but because they weren't profitable anymore. Salt lost its political power because it lost its scarcity. But mechanization wasn't the only change. Refrigeration destroyed salt's most important function. For thousands of years, if you wanted to preserve meat, you had one option: salt. Drying was unreliable. Smoking helped, but not enough. Fermentation worked for some foods, not others. Salt was the only sure thing. 1876. Carl von Linde invents the first practical refrigeration system. By 1900, refrigerated rail cars are transporting fresh meat across continents. By 1920, home refrigerators are becoming common in wealthy households. By 1950, Refrigeration is standard in the developed world, and suddenly, you don't need salt to preserve food anymore. You can eat fresh meat in December, ship fish from the coast without salting it, store vegetables for weeks without pickling. Salt's essential function, the reason it mattered, becomes optional. The salted fish industry dies almost overnight. No one wants salt cod when they can have fresh cod. No one wants salted pork when they can have fresh bacon. The preservation techniques that shaped cuisines for millennia become niche products, specialty items, nostalgic throwbacks. Here's the irony. We use more salt now than ever before in human history, 280 million tons per year, but almost none of it is for food preservation. 65% of salt production goes to chemical manufacturing, making chlorine, caustic soda, plastics, detergents. 12% goes to de-icing roads in winter. 6% goes to water treatment. Only 6% goes to food. And most of that is for seasoning, not preservation. Salt became an industrial commodity. A chemical ingredient, a thing you throw on sidewalks. Think about what that means. For 10,000 years, salt's entire value was about human survival. Food preservation, biological necessity. Now, 94% of salt production has nothing to do with food at all. We still need it to live. Our bodies haven't changed, but civilization no longer depends on it. And something was lost in that transformation. Salt stopped being sacred, stopped being valuable, stopped being something you thought about. It became invisible again, but not because it was scarce, because it was everywhere. We went from fighting wars over salt to using it to melt ice on highways. But before salt became cheap, before refrigeration replaced preservation, before the Industrial Revolution changed everything, there was one last great act of resistance, one final moment when salt meant something more than economics, when a single man walked to the sea to make salt illegally and brought an empire to its knees. India, 1930. Gandhi. This is where our story reaches its climax. Modern salt is nothing like historical salt. Ancient salt was gray, brown, sometimes pink, full of minerals, impurities, traces of whatever else was in the source. Modern table salt is 99.9% pure sodium chloride. Here's how it's made. Raw salt, whether from mines or evaporated. Seawater gets dissolved in water to create brine. That brine is filtered to remove calcium, magnesium, and other minerals. Then it's evaporated in vacuum chambers under controlled conditions. The result is perfectly uniform crystals. Those crystals are dried, ground to exact specifications, and packaged. Every grain identical, every box the same. This standardization happened fast. In 1900, salt varied wildly by region and source. Different colors, different textures, different mineral content. By 1950, industrial salt production had created a global standard. Table salt in New York is chemically identical to table salt in Tokyo. Same purity, same crystal size, same everything. This made food manufacturing predictable. Recipes worked the same everywhere. Salt became a reliable industrial ingredient. But the most important change wasn't purity. It was iodine. In the early 20th century, large parts of the world suffered from iodine deficiency. Iodine is essential for thyroid function. Without it, you develop goiter, a swelling of the thyroid gland. In severe cases, it causes brain damage, stunted growth, and intellectual disability in children. In the American Midwest, the goiter belt, up to 70% of people showed signs of deficiency. In 1924, the United States started adding iodine to table salt. Not much, about 45 micrograms per gram of salt. Barely detectable, but enough. Within a decade, goiter rates dropped by 90% in areas using iodized salt. Intellectual disability rates fell dramatically. Infant mortality decreased. This was one of the most successful public health interventions in history. By the 1990s, over 70% of households worldwide were using iodized salt. Countries like China saw goiter rates drop from 20% to less than 5% after mandatory salt iodization. Today, an estimated 2 billion people get their iodine primarily from salt. It works because salt is universal. Rich people buy salt. Poor people buy salt. Everyone uses it daily. You can't target a public health intervention more efficiently. Fortify the one ingredient everyone consumes, and you reach the entire population. Now let's talk about where modern salt actually goes. The average American consumes about 3,400 milligrams of sodium per day. Only 10% comes from the salt shaker or on your table. 5% occurs naturally in food. The other 85% comes from processed and restaurant foods. Salt serves multiple functions in processed food. Preservation, and it still extends shelf life, even with refrigeration. Flavor enhancement, it makes cheap ingredients taste better. Texture modification, it affects how proteins bind in processed meats. Moisture retention, it keeps products from drying out during storage. Masking, it covers up off flavors from preservatives and additives. Salt is in everything now. Bread 200 to 400 milligrams per slice. Canned soup 800 to 1200 milligrams per serving. Frozen pizza 700 to 1400 milligrams per serving. Deli meat 400 to 600 milligrams per serving. Cheese 150 to 300 milligrams per slice. Even foods that don't taste salty. Breakfast cereals, cookies, pastries contain significant amounts. This isn't accidental. Food manufacturers discovered that salt, sugar, and fat trigger reward responses in the brain. It's formulated with optimal levels of all three sell better. Salt became a tool for making cheap ingredients palatable and ensuring product consistency across billions of units. The processed food industry uses millions of tons of salt annually. One major food manufacturer might purchase 50,000 tons of salt per year, just one company. Multiply that across thousands of brands, and you see why food-grade salt remains a massive industry, despite representing only 6% of total production. We started with a simple question. How did something so ordinary, something sitting in a shaker on your table right now, shape the entire arc of human civilization? And the answer turned out to be completely. Salt began as survival, a biological necessity our bodies couldn't produce. The mineral that kept our nerves firing, our muscles contracting, our hearts beating. Early humans traveled hundreds of miles to find it, mapping the locations of every salt spring, every dried lake bed, every coastal flat where seawater pooled and evaporated. Then we learned to extract it, mine it, trade it, control it, and it became power. Empires were built on salt. Rome paid its soldiers with it. China funded dynasties with it. France sparked a revolution because of it. Salt enabled cities to exist, made army mobile, turned local trade into global networks. For 10,000 years, if you controlled salt, you controlled everything. And then, in less than a century, that power vanished. Not because salt stopped being essential. Your body still needs it, just as much as the Roman legionaries did, but because we made it abundant. Mechanization flooded the world with salt. Refrigeration replaced preservation. Industrial chemistry found new uses that had nothing to do with food. Salt went from the most valuable substance on Earth to something we throw on highways to melt ice. From essential mineral to invisible additive. That's the arc. And it reveals something fundamental about how power works. Power doesn't live in objects. It lives in scarcity. When something is rare and necessary, it's valuable. When it becomes abundant, that value disappears. Salt didn't change. We changed our relationship to it. The same pattern repeats throughout history. Spices were once worth more than gold. Now they're cheap commodities in grocery stores. Information was controlled by those who could read and write. Now it's everywhere. Free. Overwhelming. Energy defined the 20th century, the way salt defined the ancient world. Whoever controlled oil controlled geopolitics. And now, We're trying to make energy abundant too. This is what salt reveals. Every resource that seems permanent, every power structure that seems unshakable, is temporary. Abundance breaks monopolies. Technology redistributes control. What's essential today becomes trivial tomorrow. This is why we study food. Not because food is just food, but because food is everything. Bread built settled civilization. Sugar fueled the slave trade and industrial revolution. Chocolate became currency and luxury. And salt? Salt was power itself for most of human history. These aren't ingredients. They're forces. They shaped where we lived, how we organized societies, who ruled and who served. They started wars, ended empires, changed the course of nations, and now they're all abundant. We have more salt, sugar, bread, and chocolate than any civilization in history. But we've forgotten what they meant. We've forgotten the labor that produced them, the systems that controlled them, the people who fought and died for them. We've turned survival into convenience. So the next time you reach for salt, and you will, because your body still needs it, remember this: you're touching something that built empires and broke them, that crossed deserts and oceans, that people were enslaved for, executed for, went to war for. It's ordinary now. But it wasn't always, and that matters. If you enjoyed this story, there's more waiting for you. This is Taste of History. Thanks for watching.